Lead story of the New York Times today, page one above the fold, Dateline Montreal. Canada on Wednesday struggling to fight an extraordinary outbreak of wildfires across the country that sent smoke pouring over the border and forced millions of Canadians and Americans to stay indoors as skies darkened over large portions of both nations. Over 400 fires burned in Canada, and blazes this year have already scorched roughly 9.8 million acres of forest, more than 10 times the acreage that had burned by this time last year, officials say, sending smoke billowing down the east coast of the United States from New York past Washington as far west as Minnesota. In just listening a moment ago to the top of the hour news feed, I heard them say experiencing the very worst of it right now, the Philadelphia area. And then they had someone interviewed who said, as I said in the last hour of the program, it smells outdoors like a campfire. I want to try and put this in a larger context, if that's appropriate, with my next guest, Dr. Michael Mann. He's the Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania, with a secondary appointment in the Annenberg School of Communications, also, among other things, co-founder of realclimate.org, author of more than, count 'em, 200 peer-reviewed and edited publications, numerous op-eds, commentaries, and 5 books. They include The Hockey Stick and The Climate Wars. This is Dr. Mann. Dr. Mann, thanks so much for coming back to the program, especially because I know I'm interrupting you on a college tour of your own.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It's great to be with you. And that's true. I'm out of Philadelphia, I guess, somewhat fortuitously, not experiencing the sort of the hellscape, frankly, that you described. You know, with Philadelphia and New York City, here in the Midwest, visiting schools with my daughter. But here, all the way out in central Illinois, we can see and smell the smoke here as well. And so that gives you some idea of the scale of what we're seeing.
What connection, if any, to the overall concern of climate change?
Well, you know, we have to put this in that broader context. You know, we're seeing far more widespread drought and summer heat, and those are the ingredients that give you these massive wildfires, like we saw down in Australia back during the black summer of 2019, 2020. I was there to witness it firsthand, and what we've seen on the West Coast in recent summers, and we're now seeing something similar on the East Coast. We're not used to seeing that back east, and unfortunately, one of the projections of the climate models, state-of-the-art climate models that we use to sort of predict what scenarios may, you know, unfold in the future, one of the things they predict is, in fact, one of the areas that sees the largest relative increase in the combination of factors, drought and heat, or behind these wildfires, is in fact the East Coast. We're used to thinking about the West Coast when we think of those wildfires, but the East Coast is likely to see the greatest increase in the conditions that give rise to these fires, and we're seeing that play out. And so, understood in that longer, in that wider context, this is exactly the thing that we expect to see, and we expect it to get much worse if we fail to do anything, namely, if we fail to stop pumping carbon pollution into the atmosphere.
I made passing reference to climate change an hour ago in just saying that you'd be here and we'd be talking about this subject, and a Canadian caller was then on air and said, "You're wrong," meaning this Michael, wrong to associate this with climate change. Instead, it's all a matter of forest management. Just like, in fact, the caller said, just as it was in Northern California. You'd say what to that individual should he still be listening?
Yeah, I would say, you know, unfortunately, these talking points, we see them sort of, put out there every time one of these events happens. I witnessed this with the Murdoch media, frankly, in Australia when I was there. We see the same thing with the Murdoch media here and, other, conservative media organizations that have for decades denied the reality and threat of climate change. They marshal these, seemingly credible but completely specious talking points about land management, about arson. These are really shop-worn myths, and they're widely repeated. They're promoted, again, by conservative media, by Fox News, by the Murdoch media in particular. And so those, who get their information from those media sources have basically been polluted with these false, this false understanding of what's going on. The science is very clear here. We've seen a remarkable increase in the combination of factors, heat and drought, that lead to the very conditions that give rise to these wildfires. And it's a canard, it's specious argument to say, well, it was started by a lightning strike or it was started by, arson. It doesn't matter what starts the fire. There's always going to be something that can ignite these fires when conditions are ripe for them, when it's dry enough and hot enough. Well,
and I guess, and Dr. Mann, I guess your point would be that no matter how it started, you'd not see 9.8 million acres devoured if we didn't have the drought conditions. You might still have the fire, but it wouldn't spread so quickly, is your point.
That's exactly right, Michael. In fact, that's where I was going. It's, regardless of what started the fire, what determines how quickly they can spread, how hot they burn, and how extensive they can become and how destructive they can become is, again, the amount of fuel that's out there in the form of, dry, dead vegetation, weakened forests from the combination of heat and drought that we're seeing.
I said that in the news break at the top of the hour that preceded your appearance, someone who was interviewed coincidentally in Philadelphia said it smells like a campfire. That is what it smells like. But the danger is I'm not just sitting around smelling burning logs, right? A lot of things are getting burned and put up into the atmosphere by these fires. I mean, I'm sure it's not just logs. I'm sure it's cars, and I'm sure it's other pollutants. And the real risk here is that 100 million of us in North America right now are breathing in the remnant of all of that.
Yeah, that's right, Michael. And, it was really deja vu for me because, like I said, I was in Australia for a sabbatical during the Black Summer. And every time I'd go out my door, I would see the smoke. I would smell it. I know what that feels like. And I was seeing the same thing in central Pennsylvania in State College before we left yesterday. It was the same smell. It was the same look. And it was so it was deja vu. And it was just this eerie feeling, I've seen this before. And you're absolutely right. It isn't just the wildfire smoke and the particulates, although the particulates are problematic, especially the so-called PM 2.5, these very small particulates that you get in these wildfires that get down into your lungs and can do a lot of damage, both in the short term and the long term, especially among the elderly and young, especially among those who already have compromised lungs and lung capacity. The wildfire smoke alone has made New York City an extremely dangerous place, has made Philadelphia an extremely dangerous place right now, where you're best, just simply staying indoors right now. But beyond that, you're absolutely right. To the extent that other materials, man-made materials, get burned, there are all sorts of toxic chemicals that become part of that toxic sort of stew of particles and chemicals that we're subject to. We've changed the environment in this way. We've created infrastructure that can burn, that can actually add to the danger of these wildfires. And so, the air quality in New York City yesterday was the worst air quality in the world. I think Philadelphia right now is right up there. And so, we think about Mumbai and Beijing, these polluted cities. Air quality right now, a whole lot worse in the eastern U.S.
Another dopey question from me. Is this what nuclear winter looks like? Maybe I've seen too many movies, but you can't see the sun. I'm not outdoors now. I have windows, but I can't see the sun. But yesterday I couldn't see the sun. I mean, isn't that what happens? A nuclear cloud takes over, blocks the sun, vegetation dies. If it were to be permanent, obviously this is going to keep moving and be gone by the weekend. But answer that question.
Yeah, it's gratuitous of me to mention. It's actually, there's a whole chapter on nuclear winter and what we can learn from it in my forthcoming book, Our Fragile Moment, which comes out this September. It's about the lessons that we can learn from the past. And certainly, nuclear winter was a wake-up call. It was the recognition that we could alter the climate through a global thermonuclear war. I sort of grew up at the time, in the mid-1980s, when that was, that threat was very much at the forefront of the public discourse. There were movies like The Day After about it, the war games. I grew up during that era. Then we understood that there's a dangerous impact that we can have on the planet through, nuclear war. Today we understand, that climate change, the greatest threat right now seems to be less, that nuclear war threat. And these wildfires, they're never going to reach the extent of sort of the global dust cloud that you would get in a global thermonuclear war. So, you won't really get a nuclear winter out of these large wildfires. They can have a temporary impact, but in the end, of course, the greater climate threat today isn't the possible cooling from a global nuclear war. It's the warming effect of carbon pollution. And once again, there's a simple solution. The dinosaurs died essentially in a similar episode. I talk about that in the book, very much like nuclear winter. And in fact, the discovery in 1980 that an asteroid had killed the dinosaurs through, ultimately we would understand the nuclear, this global dust cloud and this winter-like conditions that it created. They couldn't see it coming, and they couldn't do anything about it. We can see it coming, and we can do something about it. And that's true of the threat of nuclear war and nuclear winter, and it's true of the even greater threat we face today of human-caused climate change.
You and I last spoke in March, and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, had just come out with a new report. I think it was like a compendium of different reports. You'll know better than I. But from my notes, I recall that it said that the global average temperatures are estimated to rise 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's 2.7 Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial levels sometime around the first half of the 2030s, and that the Earth has already warmed 1.1 degree Celsius. So our margin for error here is greatly diminished.
Absolutely. And in fact, to that point, you may have even seen the press release about a week and a half ago. World Meteorological Organization just put out their new annual report, and they point out that sometime within the next few years, for the first time, we could temporarily breach that 1.5 Celsius, roughly 3 degree Fahrenheit warming level. We won't, the trend line isn't going to cross. That won't happen for decades, and in fact, we can prevent that from happening with adequate reductions. But we will at least temporarily, with a big El Nino event, cross that threshold for a year or two, which is a wake-up call. It tells us how perilously close we are to some of these critical danger thresholds of warming and everything that comes with it.
Someone listening who's a critic might say, you, Dr. Michael Mann, have never met extreme weather that you don't attribute to climate change. You'd say what to them?
Yeah, I would say that, we scientists, we don't have an agenda. We don't want climate change to happen. We'd prefer for it not to happen, and we hope that the science we do can inform the policies necessary to prevent that. We go where the data takes us, and I'll give you an example of that. Back in the 1990s, some of the early work that I did led to the notion of a natural cycle called the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. Basically, this long-term natural oscillation that appeared to be associated with warming temperatures in the Atlantic and increasing hurricanes. And so the implication of that work was that some of these impacts were natural. They weren't due to human-caused climate change. I actually sort of popularized that notion with some of my early work. Over the last few years, we've done additional work where we've determined that that there isn't actually credible evidence. Now that we have more data, we have better models, there isn't credible evidence for this so-called oscillation. And so I end up refuting my own work, refuting my own hypotheses. And that's what you do as a scientist. You go where the data and the observations and the understanding leads you, regardless of what conclusions it may,
Okay, so here's my takeaway. My takeaway from Dr. Michael Mann, the Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Health and Environmental Science at Penn, is to say, don't be surprised by this. This is what drought and summer heat beget and it is tied to the bigger picture of climate change. It's yet another warning, of which there have been many, many recently. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And I'll throw one little wrinkle in as well. There's what we understand pretty well, the basics, and that's what we've talked about here. Then there are sort of the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, as we've heard before. And in this case, one of the things that happened with this event, a very unusual jet stream pattern. If you've seen the jet stream, it's meandering way north and south, and it's even sort of crashing down from Canada, going west rather than east. The jet stream, is sort of doing this funny loop that's actually leading it from east to west, from Canada into eastern U.S. and the Midwest. It's a very unusual jet stream pattern that's bringing all that smoke from Canada down into the United States, all the way out here in the Midwest. And one of the things we're starting to understand is that climate change is leading to that sort of behavior of the jet stream in the summer in a way that isn't actually very well captured in the models. So this too may be a consequence, at least an indirect consequence of climate change, but it's one of those sort of known unknowns. It's not yet really captured in the models that we use to project all of this.
Dr. Mann, good luck with the college tour. Thank you for allowing me to interrupt it.
Oh, thanks. Always a pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
And when the book comes out, we'll talk about it. So good luck with that, too.
Sounds great. Thanks again.
It's Dr. Michael Mann, ladies and gentlemen.